All right. Well, speaking of garbage, so we've gone through all the news stories that I wanted to cover on today's stream, but you've known me for a long time. You know that I like to get deep into the weeds on some of these wonky industry things, and
Yeah.
so to everyone out there who's come to join us for the news bits, I want to thank you for coming. You're welcome to stay as I talk about some really geeky, how the sausage is made, Hollywood industry stuff. But if you want to leave, I won't blame you for it, because what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the show is about how Netflix measures the success of its original series and movies. And the reason I want to talk about this is because I get really annoyed when I see other YouTubers and Twitter users and stuff like that talk about ratings for for some of these shows. Now, Book of Boba Fett, for instance, right? We talked about that earlier on in the show, and one of the things that is really interesting to me is there's like a cadre of people out there who are rooting for Star Wars to fail, and so they come out and any kind of like even remotely bad news that they can kind of jump on, they're going to highlight and they're going to scream it at the top of their lungs. And I don't mind that because, it's a passionate part of the fan base. But what I do mind is when it's objectively wrong. And the more that the critics of the stuff that Lucasfilm is doing wrong kind of point out stuff that's just not factually accurate,
you should demand that YouTube take those videos off their platform, or you will no longer do the Salty Nerd podcast. Man.
Well, no, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually like educate some people, and hopefully that'll be something that people can point to and be like, hey, this is the real thing. So, I don't have like any like deep insider information. I worked in Hollywood for a couple of years. I kind of live, breathe, and eat this stuff. I'm a big wonk for it. I like the behind the scenes business aspect of Hollywood. And the big thing here is that when people criticize a show, whether it be like, the new Doctor Who or Star Wars or what's another thing that people are hating on right now, like Game of Thrones or whatever the case may be, they're always like, oh, it's a failure because the ratings are bad. And one of the interesting kind of side effects that has happened to Hollywood because of the streaming revolution is that the old method of judging whether or not a show is successful is now no longer applicable.
Okay.
Right? And Netflix, being the leading streaming service out there, is kind of the one that is setting the stage for the other streamers to judge their content.
Makes sense.
So one of the things that people might not be aware of is that ratings come from a company called Nielsen or Nelson, one of those two.
Nielsen, yeah.
The Nielsen's rating system. And the way that Nielsen worked was back in the days when you had like broadcast or cable, they would go out and they would select people to participate with their rating system, and they would put like a box on their TV that kind of monitored what they watched and how long they watched it and stuff like that. And then from that sample, they would extrapolate, so they'd be like, we know that this household has this demographic in it and they watched this stuff. And so that must mean that among this demographic, we can assume that this many people watched it. And then networks would take that information, and based on how popular their show was and what demographic it reached, they would then sell advertisements on their shows. So a lot of soap operas that got, the middle-aged stay-at-home moms would sell advertising to like, house cleaning products or, feminine hygiene products, like stuff like that.
Literally, thus the name. They started out when back in the day,
so,
there was a corporate sponsor for every TV show. It was the soap companies.
Exactly. And so over time, people have kind of come to look at ratings as just like how many people watch something, right?
Mm-hmm.
If there were tons of ratings, then it means tons of people watched it. It was like super popular, super successful. But in the day and age of streaming services don't need to extrapolate. They don't need to guess. They don't need a
Right.
third party to come in and tell them how good their shows are doing, and they don't need to sell advertising. Some do, but
Must
they
be
don't need
nice.
to. Yeah, um, but they know to like the T what their metrics are, and what I mean by that is they know how many people start watching a show. They know at what point they stop watching a show. Uh, they know everything about your watch habits, and they know what your demographic is, your age, your race, like all that stuff. They have it down to a science,
Yep.
especially Netflix. Like Netflix knows everything about like what you like to watch, like how long you've watched it for, like all this other stuff. And so like Star Trek Discovery is like a good example of this, where people are like, oh, nobody's watching Star Trek Discovery. The ratings are bad. Why hasn't it been canceled yet? How does it keep getting renewed? The ratings are terrible, blah, blah, blah. And what I wanted to do today is kind of go through some of the stuff that Netflix looks at to determine whether or not a show is successful. Because we got to remember that Netflix and all the other streaming services out there don't sell products, right?
Right.
They're not selling commercial space or anything like that. They're a subscription service. And so their goal is to attract new subscribers and retain the ones that they currently have.
Right.
Right. So I know for a fact that Netflix has something like a 4% churn rate, which means that every month they lose about 4% of their subscribers.
Okay.
But they also are so focused on attracting new subscribers. They got something like over 200 million subscribers around the world. And so they're making tons of money every month. And the way that they judge whether or not a show is successful is very different than the way that old networks used to.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of people need to understand how streaming services evaluate original content in order to get their head around like oh, Book of Boba Fett isn't a failure because of these metrics. You can say it's a failure, but you'd be wrong because these metrics prove you otherwise. And so I just wanted to go through them real quick and kind of give people an idea of the kind of down and dirty numbers, and it might get a little bit boring. I'm just going to warn you right now. So if you want to jump off, I'm not going to blame you, but I'm going to go through this just for my own ego's sake.
Well, look, though, man, I think there's some value in this if you're frustrated by whatever content you like to consume. If you don't feel like it's up to snuff, knowledge is power, and actually understanding what the mechanisms are behind the scenes that's dictating what lives and dies. I think being able to have mastery of understanding that is important. So this is good, man. I'm looking forward to it. Fire away.
Oh, well, I'm glad, and hopefully people will get something out of this because let's face it, Netflix and a lot of these studios, they don't publicly come out with this stuff. Like I had to do a butt ton of research.
Yeah, I was actually curious about where you were getting your information.
Well, oddly enough, a former employee of Netflix leaked some internal documents that talked about how they evaluate some of the shows, and there have been interviews with people like what's his name, Scott Stuber, who's the Netflix global chief of film. Like he's the guy who determines what original films that they either acquire or make.
Yeah,
and in a recent interview, he kind of spilled some of the beans about like this stuff. So I wanted to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit and share some of this information with the public, just so they know going forward. It's like, this is why these crappy shows keep getting renewed. So the big thing that Netflix looks at is a weird kind of ratio of how much it costs to do something like a TV show or a movie compared to viewership. And this ratio, the term they have for it is called the efficiency score. How efficient is the show? Like if we spend $1 million on this show.
Very dystopian. Great.
Yeah. If they spend $1 million on a show and it gets them this many hours of view time, then that was money well spent because it retained people and it brought new people into the subscription service. So you got to remember that Netflix's entire goal is to attract new subscribers, and keep them there once they're there, because they know how many subscribers are in danger of canceling. And the way that they know that is that they look at when was the last time you watched Netflix and how long did you watch it for?
Okay.
So they know that there's a certain number of people out there who haven't turned Netflix on in a number of weeks, right? They just haven't either had time or interest to watch it. And so they categorize those people as in danger of canceling. And their churn rate of 4%, that's pretty predictable. And it goes up and down month to month. But for the most part, they know how many people they're going to lose, and they know how many people they want to gain. And so all of their decisions on what shows they're going to put money behind, what shows they're going to renew, and all this other stuff comes down to this idea of efficiency. And efficiency is basically a score of 1. So a 1 efficiency means that it's neutral. Anything less than a 1 is bad. It means they spent more than they got out of that show or movie. And anything above a 1 is phenomenal. It's a success, right? So as long as an original series or original movie is above a 1 score of efficiency, Netflix considers it a success, right?
And this is their method of quantifying the show or movie's ability to advance those goals of retention and growth.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and it's basically just price compared to viewership. That's the dumbed down version of it.
Sure.
So for instance, they spent $21 million on Squid Games, right? That had an efficiency of something like 48, right?
And that's why there's going to be a second season.
Yes. They estimated that the impact score of having that in terms of viewership and free press coverage and awareness of the brand and all that other stuff equated to close to $1 billion. Okay. Which is why the efficiency score was so high. Yeah. They only spent $21 million on that thing. Now, in contrast to that, the latest Dave Chappelle comedy special, they spent $24 million. They paid Dave Chappelle $24 million to let them record his special and put it out on Netflix. And that's like a 90-minute comedy special. That had an efficiency score of 0.8. So they looked at that as, a bad investment, which is crazy, right? Like Dave Chappelle, but it was because of the negative publicity from his trans controversy and all that other stuff. So efficiency is kind of like the overall general score with which they use to rate a original offering. Now, part of that efficiency score is another very important metric that people need to understand, which is called adjusted viewer share, okay, or AVS. So adjusted viewers, it's a way where you can't just say okay, 70 million people watch this thing, right? That's not accurate enough. So what they do is they do adjusted viewership. And adjusted viewership is a way to weight the importance of a viewer, right? So for instance, people who just signed up to Netflix, the stuff that they watch is weighted heavier. It's given more, importance because they're fresh and Netflix likes to see what they're watching. Same thing with someone who hasn't watched Netflix in several weeks, or the people that they think are in danger of canceling. If they come back and watch a show, that's weighted heavier because that's helping them with retention, right? Now, someone who watches Netflix every day, 8 hours a day, they're given less.
Who gives a damn?
Yeah, exactly. So they have this adjusting scale of how they measure viewership, right? So not all viewers are equal. Some viewers.
Yeah, I am sorry to report that my household has absolutely no impact on the programming decisions at Netflix in that case.
And Netflix's kind of range at which they look at is 28 days.
Okay.
So the first 28 days of the release of a original series or a movie or something like that is the most important deciding factor in whether or not they're going to spend more money on it.
Okay.
Right? So efficiency and adjusted viewer share is basically their two big metrics. So when you combine adjusted viewer share with the budget of a show or movie, you come up with the efficiency score. And that's how they kind of rate things. And the efficiency score is the most important internal statistic in determining the success of a project. Okay. And basically, Netflix looks at three different things in determining the success of a TV show in terms of watch hours, because watch hours is a big thing. The more time people spend watching something, the more time they're invested in Netflix, the more likely that they're going to be to stay or like whatever. So they look at how many people started watching something, right? So that's another metric. How many people got at least 2 minutes into an episode or a movie? So there's a 2-minute mark. Then there's the completionist. How many people watched the whole thing?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's watch through, where it's like, okay, people watched episode 1, but they didn't watch episode 2. Or people watched episode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Or people watched 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then they didn't care enough to finish the series. Yeah. So all this data tells them something, right? And so they factor that into their efficiency score. So like if people are really hyped about a show and they start watching a show, but they only make it like 2 episodes in for the most part, that affects the efficiency rating.
Right. Okay.
So basically, Netflix, they place an importance on engagement measured by how many hours are viewed. That's how they determine engagement, is through watch time. The more watch time something gets, the more hours something is viewed, the more Netflix considers it to be engaging with their audience. And that's important because that's what's going to keep subscribers around. That's going to bring in new subscribers into the service. So it also counts rewatching through the metrics that they measure. So like someone who watches something once, that's one thing. But if they go back and they again, so like if you rewatch The Office like 5-6 times on Netflix, they're like, okay, we're adding more weight to the rewatch because that's stickiness, that's engagement, that's keeping people around. So the more times something gets watched by the same person, the more weight that it's added onto it. And this is why something like Star Trek can be renewed, even though it's not very good, is because you have a hardcore fan base that'll sit there and rewatch it, over and over again, right? Mm-hmm. So like the more dedicated the fan base who rewatches this stuff, if you got like a show like Buffy the Vampire Slayer that my fiance rewatches like once a year, or something like that, that's going to have a higher efficiency than something that she watches only once and quits on, And that's also something that they look at when a new season comes out, where it's like, did people go back and rewatch season 1? So right. that adds to it. So Netflix really looks at the amount of hours that are viewed and looks at rewatch hours as well in order to kind of come up with this metric. And one of the interesting things I found in my research was that Netflix accounts for 6% of total TV viewing time in the United States. So out of all the time people are watching TV, 6% of that time is spent on Netflix. Now, to give you a little bit of contrast to that, YouTube also has 6% of the TV watch time in the United States. So Netflix and YouTube are on equal ground in terms of like market share of TV watch time.
Those numbers actually felt a little low to me. And I mean, I guess they're not, but like I would have imagined them to be a little even higher than they are.
You would think, but when you consider how much is being watched at any given time in the US, between the two of those, that's 12% of all TV, right? And if you look at YouTube's metrics, one of their big metrics is watch time, right? In order to get monetized, you need 40,000 hours of watch time, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So Netflix and YouTube are actually looking at very similar statistics. Mm-hmm. Although, like they have thumbnails on Netflix that they test out, but on YouTube, it's user-created thumbnails and stuff like that. And so, like, Netflix is constantly testing thumbnails to get people to check out stuff because Netflix doesn't advertise their material.
Right.
Like, they might put like a trailer out on YouTube or something like that, but for the most part, they just kind of try to figure out when you log into your Netflix account, what do you want to watch? And they try to put that in front of you. And YouTube does the same thing.
You are certainly savvy enough, Matt. I imagine when you log into Netflix, are you like me, like picking up when they changed the thumbnail and thinking like, ah, oh, that's interesting. They went with like a neutral background color and a very simple image versus yesterday it looked like a Drew Struzan poster, right? Yeah, it's fascinating.
Well, Netflix
actually
released a study on what they did on thumbnails.
Okay.
Where they kind of talked about all the split testing that they've done and what they found works best. And it's interesting stuff like, for instance, a picture of a villain works better than a picture of a hero. And so oftentimes you'll like when you saw the Squid Game stuff, it was always the guys with like the masks and like, you know, the shapes on the mask and stuff like that, as opposed to the actual contestants of the show. And they found that, like, you know, bad guys just tend to, you know, evoke a stronger emotion. People want to like check them out. They also said that faces, like people's faces, tend to perform better than things or abstract images. Right. And people with a obvious emotion on their face, like, you know, tend to perform better than people who are like stoic.
Okay.
And there are also regional differences. Like, for instance, people in Germany respond to things differently than people in the United States, and people in Mexico respond to things differently. So,
sorry, I was just thinking of the Mike Myers Dieter character when he cuts the scene of the guy with his face covered in ants. Ants. So the German audience probably responds to faces covered in ants more than other parts of the world.
Well, actually, the German audience, they said, responds more to
sprockets. That was the name of that sketch.
Abstract stuff. So abstract images tend to resonate well with German audiences. Whereas
that is shocking. What a shocking revelation.
Yeah, images of characters tend to respond better in the United States. But one of the interesting things about the watch time stuff that we were just talking about is, so Scott Stuber did an interview about Red Notice, which was the Ryan Reynolds, Gal Gadot, The Rock movie that came out on Netflix.
And that did very well for them, right?
Oh yeah, it was a huge hit. And he actually kind of spilled some tea about how they, you know, kind of judge these big budget original movies that they have. And so, you know, we're talking about movies that have like a $200 million budget, right? Which is A-list big budget movies in Hollywood, right? $200 million, it's kind of standard. So in order for a $200 million plus movie or TV show or whatever the case may be to be considered a success on Netflix, within the first 28 days, they have to have at least 70 million viewers on that property. And you need at least 200 million watch hours on that property to be considered a success. So it's not just one or the other, it's both. You need 70 million and 200 million watch hours. So if you break that down, basically it's every watch hour in Netflix's terms is worth $1. Mm-hmm. And every viewer, every person who's watching that is worth $3. So that's a total of like $4, right? For every hour that you watch something, you're giving Netflix $4, essentially. Mm-hmm. I found that really interesting because, you know, you often look at these good shows that are on Netflix and they get canceled. And you're like, why did they cancel that? That was a great show. But like, if it's not bringing in the efficiency to justify its cost, then to Netflix, it's a wash. And so like they'll cancel it. In fact, so Netflix's goal is to have every show that they purchase or every movie that they purchase and put on their platform pay for itself, essentially. And so in order to pay for a $200 million movie, you need the 70 million viewers and you need the 200 watch time hours. And one of the interesting things about Netflix is like, so you've always heard that Netflix cancels something after 2 seasons. That's kind of like their de facto. That's the joke. It's like 2 seasons and done.
Yep.
And a lot of people get pissed at that because they're like, oh man, the show is just getting started. You know, like what happened to these 5-7 season long things? But Netflix knows that the first 2 seasons of the show bring in the most subscribers. So like if a show's a hit, you get 2 good seasons in order to help grow the platform. By the time the 3rd season rolls around, or, you know, seasons after the 3rd, it doesn't do much to retain new subscribers or bring in new subscribers. And so to them, ending a show after a second season actually saves a lot of money, no matter how good the show is. Now, if the show's a cultural phenomenon, like something like Stranger Things or something like that, where the efficiency score is so high
Yeah.
that doesn't make sense to cancel it, because it's getting people jazzed. It brings back people who canceled to come back and watch it and stuff like that.
Sure.
That's something that they'll keep going with. But for the average original series or like whatever, 2 seasons is the most you can expect from Netflix. And a lot of people in Hollywood get very frustrated with that because they're like, hey, we were just getting started, give us a 5-season commitment. But the last time they did that, so the last time Netflix gave a 5-season commitment something was Star Trek Discovery, right?
Right, because it was the international carrier for that
Exactly,
show, right?
exactly. But Les Moonves, when he was in charge of CBS, he actually struck a very interesting deal with Netflix, where they basically paid for 5 seasons worth of the show up front, right? For the worldwide distribution rights, not the US, but the overseas. Netflix is very big overseas. And they paid for that show for its 5 seasons. And it just, and I always said, like, once that 5 seasons is up, that's probably going to be the last. And they just finished season 4. The 5th season was just announced. And after that, the Netflix money's gone. So I wouldn't be surprised if season 5 was the last season of Discovery, simply for that whole reason, is because like Netflix basically paid for that show.
If I can stop you and do a quick plug for the Salty Nerd show, I consume a fair amount of these industry commentary videos that I would probably describe as ranging from pretty mainstream news sources to some out there alternative folks who, even as I'm listening to them talk, I'm pretty sure they're full of it, but they're entertaining. And so I appreciate the flights of fancy they take because they do it in an entertaining way. But there are, like, you talked about the people who are kind of quite obviously rooting for some of these properties to fail. And so they glom on to a potentially negative storyline and they just spin it out to its worst possible conclusion. And one of the things I've always respected about you, Matt, and I was lucky that I knew you and I could go back to you and rely on what you say about this stuff, is that you are often, with the way you are reporting on this stuff, you're cutting against the grain of a lot of the predominant, like, conventional wisdom in the alternative media world on YouTube or on social media about some of these pop cultural IPs. And way more often than not, you have turned out to be right, or at least more right than what you could find dozens of clickbait videos telling you exactly what you wanted to hear, but it wasn't the reality. So I really appreciate that dynamic that you bring to the group that you guys have. So it's one of the reasons why I recommend your show to my friends who are into this kind of stuff, because I think you've got a good balance and you personally bring a valuable angle in that regard.
Yeah, I'm the egghead. I'm the film buff. It's more than just pretty pictures to me. I have to get something from it. But we were talking about at the beginning of the live stream how Peacemaker is more popular than Book of Boba Fett and The Witcher 2 and stuff like that. And when you extrapolate what we just talked about, the metrics that Netflix looks at, and assume that other streamers look at the same type of metrics to figure out whether or not a show is a success or not, you can see that Book of Boba Fett, even though it's not, the best show in the world, I would be interested to see, like, because Star Wars has such a hardcore fan base, even the people who hate it will watch it, right? Sometimes more so.
Right.
So when you look at watch hours versus, the type of viewer, because I guarantee you that the people who signed up for Disney Plus just for Star Wars stuff, like, they haven't watched Disney Plus in weeks or months before, like, Book of Boba Fett showed up, and then they came back and watched Book of Boba Fett. And so Disney looks at it and is like, oh, all these people who were absent for a long time, they came back. So we're going to weigh their viewership way more than the people who've been watching it, like, every day.
That's a good point.
And also, like these are short, short series, like only 6 episodes.
Yeah.
So like they're pretty much done within that 28-day cycle, right? And so Disney probably looks at all the metrics, and they're like, hey, Book of Boba Fett, yeah, maybe it's not the greatest show we've ever produced, but guess what? It had an efficiency of 20 or something like that. Like we got our money's worth off of that show. The viewership to cost ratio of that show skewed way in favor of viewership. You could look at all the Marvel shows in the same way too, where like I think other than Hawkeye, I haven't really liked any of the Marvel shows. Loki was okay, but Disney can look at those shows and be like, yeah, they were terrible, but the efficiency score was good, and so we're going to make more of them. And so like I think people need to like kind of reorient their brains about how Hollywood judges success in the streaming era, because it's not like if you release a movie in the theaters, you can see from the box office returns whether or not a movie is a hit or not. With streaming, the ratings, the old school ratings like Nielsen ratings, they don't apply. So like trying to talk about the ratings of a streaming show as to whether or not it's a success is a losing battle, because it's apples and oranges. It doesn't apply anymore.
Yeah.
So you need to think of things as like, how many people are watching this? How many people are talking about it? How long are these episodes? And how many people are watching the full episode, but also every episode fully? And when it comes to something like Star Wars, like The Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, every single person I know watches every single episode. When it comes to the Clone Wars, there are people out there who will rewatch that stuff over and over again, right? So the idea that Star Wars is failing because the ratings aren't good, or because they're having trouble getting the Obi-Wan series out, or like whatever the case may be, is ludicrous, because Disney Plus has these metrics that they can judge this stuff by. And by every measure that I can see, just based off of social media, based off of the people I know who are watching the show, based off my personal experience, like I'm not a big fan of Book of Boba Fett, but I've watched every episode, sometimes more than once.
Yeah.
And that's a situation where like I didn't watch anything on Disney Plus until that show came back, right? So like I think the last thing I watched on Disney Plus was Hawkeye before Book of Boba Fett,
right?
But there are people out there who like maybe they watched Black Widow and then they canceled their subscription and then came back for Book of Boba Fett or something like that. But there are all these metrics that people don't take into account, that Disney's looking at is like, wow, this is a hit. Like how much did it cost us to make Book of Boba Fett? $3. Okay. It's like we got the volume. That thing saved us a bunch of money. So like there's just all these factors that people need to take into account. And when they're listening to other people make claims that this show's a failure, everyone hates this show, blah blah blah, they need to ask them to back that up with actual numbers. It can't just be like, oh, I have a source that tells me the ratings are bad. It's like, no, you're not evaluating it the way a streamer evaluates a success. And it's that efficiency score, right? It's how much it cost versus how many people watched. And you need to figure out how that works. Otherwise, you're just going to be spreading misinformation.
In which case, it's you or Neil Young.
Yes, exactly. But the best way to get people to change, so like if you want Lucasfilm to change how they handle Star Wars, you need to be factual with your critiques of what they're doing.
Yeah.
Because if you come out with rumor and innuendo and you come off as ignorant about like how the industry actually works and how they judge success and failure, basically you're shooting yourself in the foot, because Lucasfilm is going to dismiss you. They're going to be like, these people obviously don't know what they're talking about, so why do we have to listen to anything they have to say? But the more accurate you can be with like your knowledge and your criticism, the more that you're forcing them to pay attention to you, because they're like, well, they obviously know how the business is done, so maybe their critique of what we're doing has some merit to it. And if enough people do that, they can't ignore you. If it's just a fringe of the fan base it's going around saying like we don't like this, they can ignore that because it's subjective, right? But if educated critics come out and say like, hey, we know how you're judging this, whether or not it's a success, and we're telling you that you're wrong, and here's why, then maybe you can affect some change.